I was car camping out in the middle of nowhere, just me and my old Jeep Cherokee. I'd been doing it more and more lately, packing up some gear, a few cans of food, some water, and heading out to these forgotten little side roads that branch off the county routes in the flatter parts of the state. I didn't really care if the place had a view or a hiking trail or anything special. In fact, the more boring it looked on the map, the more I liked it. I wasn't looking for adventure. I just wanted quiet. That's probably why I liked car camping in the first place. There was something about being inside the Jeep that gave me comfort, even more than a tent. Steel walls, locking doors, a roof I didn't have to worry about collapsing. I could lie my seat all the way back, stretch out, and just fall asleep with nothing but a blanket over me and the windows cracked open. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked for me. This spot I picked that weekend was out by a grazing lease area, though I didn't know it at the time. There weren't any signs, nothing to tell me the land was in use, just an old gravel pull-off with enough space for a couple vehicles, maybe a horse trailer. No fences, no cattle guards, nothing that stood out. The gravel turned into dirt not too far down, but it looked dry enough. I eased the Jeep back into a little shaded area just before the terrain dropped off into a shallow ravine, parked facing downhill in case I needed to get out fast, and set up camp. Camp, in this case, just meant clearing some of the junk off my passenger seat and inflating my sleeping pad. I wasn't planning on cooking anything crazy, just some beef stew out of a can and a protein bar. I wasn't even going to bother with a fire. There wasn't another soul out there. No light except the moon and stars. I ate dinner leaning against the hood of the Jeep, the sun slowly dipping behind the trees in the distance. It wasn't cold, but it was getting cooler by the hour, and the breeze had picked up a little. I liked it. Around 9:30 or so, I climbed back inside, locked the doors, cracked the front windows about 3 inches, and got settled in for the night. The wind had picked up more than I expected, and every once in a while it would whip across the open ground and rattle through the trees or hit the Jeep just right and make the roof creak. I had my sleeping pad laid out, blanket over me, arms crossed on my chest, trying to ease into sleep. I wasn't fully asleep yet when I heard something crunch outside. Gravel or dry grass, something like that. My eyes snapped open, and I just lay there, breathing slow. I figured it was probably an animal. Deer maybe, could have been a raccoon. I wasn't worried. I didn't move. The sound faded away and the wind kept up, and I closed my eyes again. I don't know how long I was out, but it couldn't have been more than an hour before something else pulled me back. Not a noise this time, a feeling, like something had changed. I kept my eyes closed and listened. The wind had died down. It was dead quiet out there. The air felt heavier somehow, and I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears. Then I heard it, a snort. It wasn't loud, not exactly, just a sudden, wet exhale. Right next to me, my heart jumped so hard in my chest I thought it might stop. I bolted upright, hit my head on the roof, and scrambled to sit up straight. Something big was outside the Jeep, right outside my window. I could feel it. I hadn't heard it walk up, hadn't heard anything until that sound. And it wasn't a deer. It sounded like it came from a big set of lungs, deep, wet, full of heat, like a horse or a... Then I saw it. Something large and dark shifted just outside the driver's side window. A massive shape, shoulders maybe chest high, and it was moving slow. I froze, not breathing. My hands had clutched the blanket so tight I felt my knuckles ache. I reached down slowly and turned on my little LED lantern, holding it up just enough to cast a dim glow inside the Jeep. Then, with no warning, something shoved its head in through the window gap. It wasn't fast. It was casual, like it had done it 100 times before. A long, broad face pushed through the crack with surprising ease. Wet nose, droopy mouth, wide eyes. And the breath, hot and damp, it filled the whole cab. It sighed again, long and slow, like it was tired of standing. I screamed, not out loud, but inside. Couldn't get a breath in, couldn't think, couldn't even move. I just sat there, staring at it. For a second, I thought it was a damn bear. But then the light caught the soft brown fur and the curved edge of an ear, and I realized what it was. A cow. Just a cow. It stood there with its head still in the window like it was waiting for something. Like I was supposed to know what to do. It blinked at me, huffed once more, and then slowly pulled back out. I heard it walk around the Jeep, slow, plodding steps. Another snort came from the rear window. I turned and saw a second one, this one even bigger. Its breath fogged up the glass. I sat there completely still, heart still racing. But the longer I stared at them, the more my fear started to melt into something else. Confusion, mostly, then a kind of disbelief. And finally, I just laughed. Not out loud, not a real laugh. More like a single breath of relief that slipped out without my permission. Cows. They were cows. Once the first wave of panic wore off, I actually felt a weird calm settle over me. I'd grown up around farms, had cousins with dairy cows, visited them every summer. I'd always liked cows. Big, slow, calm animals. Dumb as rocks, sure, but harmless. Seeing one out here in the middle of the night was unnerving, yeah, but it wasn't dangerous. Not really. The first one wandered off to the side of the Jeep, then slowly walked forward and crossed in front of me, casting a shadow in my lantern light. I could hear others now, off in the dark, moving in the grass, snorting, breathing. Maybe half a dozen of them. I hadn't noticed the tracks earlier when I pulled in, but now that I thought back, the ground had been pretty trampled. I just didn't know what I was looking at the time. They were probably just curious, maybe used to people feeding them, or maybe just exploring. I'd parked in their normal roaming area. I sat there in the Jeep, still half under my blanket, still clutching the lantern, and listened to them for a while. Hoof steps in the dirt, slow chewing sounds, the occasional soft grunt or snort. I couldn't sleep after that. I laid back down eventually, but every time I started to drift off, one of them would shift and brush up against the Jeep or sigh near the window, and I'd be wide awake again. It wasn't fear anymore, just nerves. My adrenaline was still coming down, and I didn't feel comfortable enough to really relax. Not yet. Eventually, they wandered off. One by one, their sounds faded into the distance. I opened the door just before sunrise and stepped out, stretching and shivering a little. The air was cold and still. I walked a slow circle around the Jeep and saw the hoof prints all over the dirt. Some were almost pressed into the gravel from their weight. There were even a few fresh cow pies not far from where I had parked. I didn't stick around for breakfast. I packed up my few things, tossed my trash into a sealed bag, and rolled out just after the first light hit the trees. The ride back was quiet, and I kept thinking about that cow's head slowly sliding into my window. How casual it was. How human it felt, in a way like someone leaning in to check on me. When I got home, I told myself I'd be more careful about where I parked next time. I looked up that area later, and sure enough, it was part of an open range section leased out to a nearby ranch. No fences, free roaming livestock, totally normal, just something I hadn't thought to check. Since then, I still go car camping, still sleep in the Jeep, but I always take a closer look at the ground. I scan for hoof prints. I keep the windows rolled up tighter. And I always remember that just because something scares the hell out of you in the moment doesn't mean it's dangerous. Sometimes it's just a cow. And funny enough, cows are still my favorite animal. I had planned the solo trip for a while. Life had been heavy the past few months. Too much work, too many people, too many demands. I wanted to be out somewhere quiet, somewhere I couldn't hear traffic, couldn't see streetlights, couldn't be bothered by anyone. I wanted the world to feel still again. So I packed light, got the tent in the trunk, brought my gear, and drove about 5 hours out into the hills of eastern Oregon. I'd found a spot online that a few people mentioned. Nothing official, just a clearing near a tree line, tucked along an old logging road. It was remote, but that's what I wanted. I parked off the dirt road where 2 tire tracks had cut into the tall grass. From there, I carried everything in by hand. Tent, sleeping pad, water, food, flashlight, everything. Took 2 trips, but I didn't mind. The air smelled like pine and dirt. The sun was dropping behind the ridge to the west, sending long golden shadows through the trees. The clearing was flat and quiet. Not even the wind moved. There were no other tents, no distant fires, no signs of anyone. It was perfect. I set up the tent fast, mostly out of habit, even though I had a couple hours of daylight left. I used my hatchet to clear out sticks and rocks from the ground. The tent was one of those one-man domes, tight, but enough. I unpacked my food, made a quick cold dinner, just some tortilla wraps with peanut butter and trail mix, and sat on a stump to eat. It was peaceful. The last birds were chirping, and a few bugs floated through the air, catching the last bit of light. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No planes, no cars, just the soft creak of trees and distant sounds I couldn't place. Branches settling, maybe a squirrel or two, but it didn't bother me. As night came, I packed everything back up. I keep things tidy when I camp. I sealed up my food and put it in a dry bag, then hung that from a tree about 50 yards out, just in case any animals wandered in. I brushed my teeth with a bottle of water and spat in the bushes. It was getting colder, so I crawled into the tent and zipped up. My watch said 9:17 p.m. The sky outside was fully black now. No moon. I lay on my back and stared up at the faint outline of the tent walls. I could hear the occasional breeze through the trees, but otherwise it was dead quiet. An hour or two passed. I wasn't sleeping yet. My body was still adjusting to the idea of sleeping in a bag, on the ground, with nothing but a thin nylon wall between me and the forest. It's normal, I never sleep well the first night out. So I lay there, eyes half closed, half awake, shifting around to get comfortable. And then I heard it, faint rustling. It was soft at first, like something brushing against leaves, maybe 30 feet off. It didn't sound like wind. It stopped. Then again, more deliberate this time. Slow. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Crunch. Then silence. I held my breath. My heart was thudding harder than I expected. It was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon or something. I told myself that, but I couldn't relax. There was a weight to the sound, like something big, careful. I didn't hear paws scampering or snuffling. It was footsteps, slow, spaced out like it was circling. My head was turned toward the tent wall, watching the faint shape of the trees outside, waiting for anything to move. Then I saw it, a silhouette, dark, bulky, moving behind the tree line. Then another one. They were hard to see but not invisible. The moon was low and weak, but it was enough to catch the shape. Something big. One moved, then another. It wasn't a person. The shape was wrong, no flashlight, no upright posture. These were hunched, four-legged, slow. They didn't make noise like deer. They were heavier. And then I heard it, a deep, bellowing, chest-rattling oh. I froze. It was so loud that the tent walls shook. I sat up straight in my sleeping bag, heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. Another moo, deeper this time, almost like a groan from a tunnel, and then rustling, louder, more forceful. I unzipped the flap a couple inches and peered outside. Cows, a whole herd of them, dozens of dark shapes, lumbering through the clearing, hooves thudding into the ground like slow drums. Their heads swayed low, their bodies huge. I could see the shine of their eyes in the distance, reflecting the moonlight like marbles. One of them walked right up near my tent, probably 5 feet away, sniffing the air. I didn't know what to do. I stayed frozen. My flashlight was right next to me, but I didn't want to spook them. I'd heard stories about cows crushing tents or stomping when startled. I didn't even know where they had come from. There were no fences, no ranch buildings for miles. They must have been free range. Maybe someone turned them loose out here for the season. They didn't seem aggressive, but their size made everything terrifying. I could hear their breathing, slow, labored huffs. One of them stepped even closer and bumped against one of the tent poles. The whole thing shook and leaned in. I held my breath again, waiting to see if it would collapse. Didn't. The cow backed away, turned, and slowly joined the others. They stayed around for maybe 15 minutes, walking, mooing, eating some of the grass near my fire ring. A few of them sniffed my backpack but didn't try to get into it. The herd eventually wandered to the far side of the clearing and disappeared into the trees. The last few moos faded into the distance. I sat up for a long time after they left. I didn't try to sleep. I kept listening. Every small rustle outside made my nerves jump. My body was tense, coiled, like I was ready to sprint out of the tent at any second. but nothing else came. The clearing stayed quiet. Around 4 a.m., I finally laid back down and closed my eyes. I didn't really sleep, but I drifted in and out of half-consciousness until the first light of morning cracked through the tent walls. When the sun was fully up, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked peaceful again. Dew was thick on the grass. My tent had a big smudge of dirt and what looked like a cow hair stuck near the bottom edge. I walked the perimeter, hooves everywhere, deep prints all across the clearing. Some had stomped near where my food bag was, but it was still hanging. I made a small breakfast, instant oats and a granola bar. I sat on the same stump I had the night before, but the air felt different. My body was still worn from the adrenaline. I had a mild headache. My limbs felt sore. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to return. They didn't. I packed up later that morning, a bit earlier than I planned. I had brought enough supplies to stay another night, but my nerves were shot. The idea of those cows returning in the night and maybe not being so calm next time just sat wrong with me. They hadn't hurt me, but the fear had done its damage. As I hiked back to the car, I kept scanning the trees. A few times I saw shapes in the distance, but they were just shadows. Nothing followed me. When I reached my car, I threw everything in fast and sat behind the wheel with the windows down. I looked back toward the woods for a long time. Then I started the engine and drove out. I don't tell that story often because people laugh. Cows? They say. You were scared of cows? But they weren't there. They didn't hear the way the ground shook. They didn't see how close those eyes got. They didn't feel the weight of being alone, completely alone, with no phone signal, no help, just a thin layer of fabric between you and a herd of half-ton animals that didn't care what you were doing there. They weren't dangerous, but that doesn't mean it wasn't terrifying. I still camp, still go out alone sometimes, but now I research more. I check the land boundaries, see if it's open range, look for grazing permits nearby. It's not that I'm scared of cows. I just don't want to wake up to that sound ever again. That moo still echoes in my chest sometimes. Not because it was dangerous, but because it reminded me how powerless we really are out there. It reminded me that nature doesn't care about our plans or fears. It just does what it wants. And sometimes that means a midnight visit from a herd of free-roaming cattle. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The four of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. There had been 5 of us when we arrived: me, Dave, Eric, Brandon, and Chris. But Eric wasn't with us anymore. He was still back at the campsite, dead inside his tent. It didn't feel real yet. My hands were still trembling, and my stomach wouldn't settle. I hadn't said anything for the past hour. None of us had. The air felt dead, the forest too quiet. Everything was wet and cold from the rain the night before, and the muddy trail pulled at our boots as we pushed forward. The flashlight beam kept swinging side to side as Dave moved, and the shadows made it worse. Every time a branch creaked or the wind rustled leaves behind us, I found myself flinching. We had to get out of there. That was all I kept thinking. Just keep walking, one foot in front of the other. The hike back was longer than it felt coming in. We had walked in fresh and excited 3 days ago. We had split the trail across 2 legs to ease the weight of our packs, camping one night partway before pushing deeper into the woods to a remote, undeveloped site near the lake. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing Brandon found on some hikers forum online. No cell service, no fire pits, no signs of other people at all. At the time, it sounded perfect. The first 2 nights were uneventful. We fished, we drank, we sat around a makeshift fire pit we built out of some loose rock. Dave brought a small speaker and we listened to music, passed around a bottle of whiskey, laughed about the hike in and told stories. It was one of those weekends where nothing really stood out but everything felt right. That changed the 3rd night. It started with Brandon waking me up. I thought he was drunk or joking at first. He kept nudging me until I opened my eyes, and I could barely see his face in the dark. He looked scared, real scared. He pointed toward Eric's tent and whispered that something was wrong. At first I thought he meant an animal like a bear or maybe a raccoon had gotten into his stuff. But when I stepped out and looked at the tent, I didn't see any movement. The tent was zipped up, but the side near Eric's head looked sunk in, like it had collapsed just slightly. I didn't hear any breathing, and I remember how strange that seemed. Eric snored, loudly. That had been the joke the night before, how no one could sleep because he sounded like a chainsaw. Brandon was already walking over, crouching by the tent and saying something I couldn't hear. Then he unzipped it and backed away fast. I didn't get close. I didn't want to. The way Brandon froze up was enough. The others started coming out, and within minutes we were all gathered around, but no one would go inside. Eventually Dave got a stick and lifted the edge of the tent's fabric. I stayed behind the others, but I still saw it. Eric was on his side. The sleeping bag was pulled halfway up, but his arm was twisted at a strange angle outside the bag. His eyes were open. I couldn't see much more in the dark, but I knew he wasn't breathing. His mouth was open like he had been trying to shout or gasp. We backed away after that. No one touched him. No one said a word. We just stood there trying to make sense of it. There had been no sounds during the night. No struggle. No yelling. No animal noises. Just quiet. At some point, Dave said we had to leave. He looked pale but steady. The rest of us just nodded. It was around 4 a.m, still pitch dark. We packed our things in silence, leaving Eric's tent exactly how we found it. We had no cell signal, and we knew we had to hike back to the trailhead to call the police. We couldn't carry him. We didn't know how he died. It was safer to go, get help, and come back. Now we were moving through the woods, the trail barely visible under the fading beam of Dave's flashlight. Chris was right behind him, then me and Brandon brought up the rear. I kept looking back every few minutes, even though I couldn't see anything but trees and darkness. Felt like something was following us. Nothing specific, just the weight of the woods pressing in. The silence was the worst part. Around an hour in, the sun started to rise. It gave everything a blue-gray hue, making the trees look like silhouettes against the dim sky. The trail widened briefly at a switchback, and we stopped for water. I sat on a log, trying not to think about Eric's face. My mind kept replaying it, the way his eyes were open, the angle of his arm. It didn't look natural. It didn't look peaceful. It looked like he had been scared. Brandon looked rough. His hands were shaking when he opened his pack. Chris just kept pacing back and forth across the trail. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he wanted to be anywhere else. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Something didn't add up. We got back up and kept walking. Around mid-morning, we reached the halfway marker where we had camped the first night. It looked different now, smaller, like the trees had closed in. We didn't stop this time, just walked straight through. The trail narrowed again, and the mud got worse. At one point, Dave slipped and nearly fell, his flashlight bouncing off a rock and flickering out. We froze, all of us standing there in the sudden silence. Then he picked it up and turned it back on. It was dimmer now. We didn't say anything. The rest of the hike was a blur. Trees, mud, silence. The sky slowly turned from gray to white as the sun rose higher. I kept expecting to hear birds or the wind or something, but it was quiet the whole way, like the woods had gone still. By the time we reached the trailhead, I was exhausted. My legs felt like they were going to give out. My clothes were soaked with sweat. I looked around for the parking lot and finally saw the outline of Dave's SUV through the trees. We rushed toward it. Dave unlocked the doors, and we all climbed in without a word. I sat in the back seat and leaned my head against the window, my heart still racing. Dave started the engine, but he didn't move, just sat there with his hands on the wheel. No one spoke. We just stared out at the woods, the same ones we had walked into a few days ago, feeling excited and free. Now they looked like something else entirely. Dave pulled out his phone and checked for signal. A bar, then 2, finally 3. He handed it to me, and I dialed 911 with shaking fingers. It rang twice before a dispatcher answered. I gave her our location as best as I could. Told her we had found our friend dead in his tent. Told her we hadn't touched anything, just packed our stuff and left to get help. She said they would send someone, park rangers and local deputies. Might be a couple hours before they got there. We waited. No one wanted to talk. The car was quiet except for the hum of the engine. I kept watching the trailhead, expecting something to come walking out of those trees. But nothing did. It's been 2 hours now. I'm writing this on my phone while we wait. My fingers still feel numb. My head is spinning. Eric is still out there, in that tent with no answers. Maybe it was a medical issue, a heart thing, maybe something we couldn't have seen coming. I hope that's all it was. The police are finally starting to rise. After I hit post, I will go back to the car so we can wait there until they arrive. I'd been a camp counselor for a few summers before, and for the most part, I enjoyed it. Working with kids at a day camp was often more exhausting than anything else, but it was rewarding. And every year, we'd do a big camp out at the end of summer. The kids looked forward to it for months, and we counselors weren't much different. It was a tradition that brought everyone together. This particular summer, we were in a new spot. The camp director had found a great little site near a park that we hadn't used before. It was tucked away in a quiet area of the park, surrounded by tall trees and a thick bramble hedge, which was just about the perfect barrier to separate us from the rest of the campers. The site was secluded enough that we didn't have to worry about other groups and their noise. There was a large clearing on the other side of the hedge, which we assumed was just a pasture for some local farm animals, though no one really gave it much thought. It wasn't like it mattered to us. After all, the kids weren't going to wander out that far, and it wasn't like we were going to cross over there. The first night was calm enough. We set up our tents, gathered around the fire pit, and roasted marshmallows and hot dogs. The kids were loud and excited, and even though it was a lot of work keeping track of them, I enjoyed the energy. Everyone was in good spirits, even the 2 lifeguards who were helping out for the weekend. We had a couple of other counselors too, all helping to supervise the kids. After a couple of hours of light games and campfire stories, it was time to settle down. We got everyone into their sleeping bags, the fire was dying down, and the camp was slowly going quiet. Most of the kids were already half asleep. Some were still whispering to each other, but the night had settled into a peaceful rhythm. I was sitting by the fire, just finishing up some final notes for the next day's activities, when I started hearing something strange. It was distant at first, just a faint clanging noise, almost metallic. It wasn't enough to cause alarm, but it sounded odd. I didn't know if it was wind chimes or maybe some equipment from another campsite. I figured it was nothing to worry about, but then it kept going. It wasn't consistent. It was like a clanging followed by a pause, then more clanging, and sometimes it was almost rhythmic. I looked around at the other counselors and saw that they had noticed it too. The kids had mostly settled down, but I could see a few of them sitting up in their sleeping bags, glancing around, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. We all just shrugged it off. Some of the kids were talking about it, but no one really seemed concerned. Then I heard something else. It was quieter than the clanging, but it was closer. The bramble hedge that separated us from the field was rustling. I glanced over at one of the counselors, unsure if I'd imagined it, but he looked as confused as I felt. The rustling continued for a few seconds, and that's when it happened. No, it wasn't just any moo. It was loud, like right in front of us loud. The sound felt like it vibrated through the whole campsite, sharp and sudden. I'm pretty sure the entire camp froze at the exact same moment. There were 50 kids, 5 counselors, and 2 lifeguards, and in that split second, no one made a sound. Then pandemonium. Screams erupted from the kids. It wasn't just a quick yelp. It was full-blown terror. I had to grab the nearest kid by the shoulders to stop them from running out of their tent. But it wasn't just the kids. The counselors were shocked too, trying to make sense of what just happened. I could hear the other kids screaming out of their tents now, some of them still not fully awake and too confused to even know what to be afraid of. The sound of dozens of feet scrambling for safety, getting tangled in sleeping bags, all mixing with the panicked yells. It was chaos. From the other campsites, I could hear other people shouting at us to be quiet, thinking maybe we were just messing around. I wanted to yell back, but my mind was racing. What the hell just happened? Was it an animal? Did something break in? No, it couldn't be. But then, in the distance, just beyond the brambles, the deep mooing came again, followed by more rustling. And the noise of hooves, a dragging kind of scraping like something heavy was moving through the underbrush. I stood up, stepping back from the fire pit and motioned for the others to gather the kids together. "It's just a cow," I said, even though I didn't fully believe it myself. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Cows did moo loudly, especially if they were startled or curious. But I wasn't sure what kind of cow would come this close to a campsite, and I definitely didn't know how it had gotten so close without us hearing it sooner. The next few minutes felt like hours. The kids were still wide-eyed and frantic, huddled together, some of them still holding their snacks or flashlights, eyes darting around. Some of the counselors started trying to calm them down. The other lifeguard and I walked toward the edge of the campsite, close to where the bramble hedge started, but we couldn't see much. We only heard the sounds getting closer, rustling in the thick undergrowth, followed by a strange sort of snuffling and snorting. Then, another explosive oh. This time, it was much closer. I couldn't help it. I jumped back. The kids screamed again. This time, I noticed that a few of the kids, their snacks still in hand, had thrown the chips and crackers they were munching on at the sound, as if they thought the cow was going to eat them. The brambles rustled again, and we all heard the crunching sound as the cow or cows moved closer. There was a few moments of silence, and I heard a soft crunching sound behind me. I turned to see one of the younger kids, Toby, peeking out from behind his tent, his hand reaching toward the bramble hedge. Another counselor quickly yanked him back. We all stood there, watching the hedge, listening to the increasingly loud snorts and chews coming from just the other side. The cow had found something edible, whether it was snacks thrown in panic or maybe just some dried leaves and twigs. It didn't matter. It was clearly enjoying itself. And I have to admit, after the initial shock wore off, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. It was just a cow. The situation had gotten out of hand because of a noise no one had expected. Cows were harmless, right? It wasn't like the thing was going to break into our camp and attack anyone. But it didn't make it any less terrifying when you're standing there in the dark with a group of 50 kids, all wondering what in the world is going on. Just as things started to settle down, 2 park rangers showed up. They had apparently heard the commotion from their patrol and came to investigate. They must have thought it was something much worse. Maybe someone had been attacked or something. The sight of the rangers seemed to calm the kids, but I could tell they were still nervous. One of the rangers turned to us, shaking his head. "You're lucky," he said. "Those cows have a funny way of getting curious. They've been wandering a bit more lately. We've had a few reports of them coming close to campgrounds." He looked around at the bramble hedge. "You might want to keep an eye on them. The cows like to roam around at night, especially near food." After everything calmed down, we had to explain to the kids why cows weren't dangerous. And even then, I could see some of them shudder when they looked out into the dark. The cows had retreated to the field, but the brambles were still rustling, and every time one of the kids heard a noise, their eyes would get wide. I tried to get everyone back into their tents, but the night had taken a toll. Even after the rangers left, we didn't get much sleep. The quiet of the night was broken now, and every little rustle seemed to set everyone off again. I don't think anyone ever fully got over the fright, but after that night, we learned a valuable lesson. Always check for wildlife before settling down in a new place. But looking back, it wasn't really the cows that scared us. It was how unexpected it was. I had never thought a cow could cause so much panic. But they are surprisingly loud when they moo in the middle of the night, right beside you. After the campout, the kids were still talking about it for the next few days. Every time I looked at one of them, I wondered if they thought cows were as scary as we all had in that moment. I don't think they did, but I sure did. And I don't know if I'll ever look at cows the same way again. But to be honest, I guess it was still a good campout. At least we all got a story out of it. I don't usually post stuff like this, but I need to write it down while everything's still fresh. I'm shaking as I type this, and I've got dirt under my nails and cuts on my arms. The sun is just now coming up behind the trees. I haven't slept in over a day. I can't stop replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of what happened. I keep checking the woods behind me every few seconds. Every snap of a twig or movement of a leaf sets my nerves off again. I'm sitting here on a big rock just up the hill from the trailhead, where I get 1 or 2 bars of cell service. My car is about half a mile away, and I didn't want to wait in it, just in case someone came back. So I climbed up here and started typing. Once I post this, I'll head down and wait in the car until the police arrive. I went camping alone 2 days ago. It wasn't my first time solo camping, and I've always enjoyed the silence of the woods, especially deep in the off-trail areas where you don't see other people. I work from home and live in a pretty busy neighborhood, so disconnecting from everything for a bit has always helped me reset. I didn't tell many people I was going, just my brother. I sent him my GPS coordinates through an app we both use whenever I go off-grid. The place I picked was part of a state forest a few hours from where I live. I had been there a few times before, but never explored this particular section. I parked at a gravel pull-off along a fire road and hiked in about 5 or 6 miles. The trees got denser the deeper I went. The trail disappeared at times, and I had to follow deer paths and use landmarks. I came across a shallow creek with a small clearing on the far side. Flat ground, soft pine needles, and just enough space for my tent. I set up camp there and got a fire going just before sunset. That first night was uneventful. I ate, sat by the fire until it burned down to coals, and crawled into my tent around 10. I read for a bit with my headlamp, then turned it off and laid back. The woods were alive with the usual sounds: owls, crickets, the wind moving through the trees, but nothing that made me uneasy. I slept off and on, woke up once or twice, and got up at sunrise. The next day, I explored further into the woods beyond the creek. I followed a small ridgeline that overlooked the valley where I had camped. I found an old deer blind someone had built into a tree, long abandoned. I didn't touch it, just noted it mentally and moved on. I didn't see a single person or even a footprint. No wrappers, no fire pits, nothing. It was about as quiet and untouched as I could have hoped for. I made it back to camp around late afternoon and started prepping for dinner. I boiled water, made a simple meal, and sat with my back against a tree watching the sky turn dark. When night settled in, it got colder than expected. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and drifted off again. This is where things start to go wrong. Around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was silence, absolute silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears feel like they're straining. No wind, no insects, no rustling, just nothing. I laid there trying not to move. I listened harder. I don't know how long I stayed like that before I finally heard it. Faint footsteps on leaves. Not animal movement either. I've heard enough deer and raccoons in the woods to know the difference. This was slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. My heart started pounding. I didn't unzip the tent or reach for my flashlight. I just stayed still, listening. The steps came closer, then stopped. Then a few more. Then silence again. I finally sat up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I reached for my knife, which I always keep next to me when I camp. I held it in my lap, staring at the tent wall in the direction I thought the sound had come from. I waited and waited. Eventually, the normal night sounds started to come back. The insects buzzing, wind in the trees. I figured maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was a raccoon. I stayed awake for a long time after that, knife in hand, until I finally nodded off again. I woke up at dawn feeling groggy and uneasy. When I stepped out of the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were faint footprints in the soft soil near the creek. Definitely human. Barefoot. They came from the direction of the ridge and led right up near the tent before turning and heading back the way they came. I hadn't heard them leave. I didn't want to overreact, so I took photos of the prints, packed up camp a little earlier than planned, and decided to hike back toward the car. I figured I'd stop at a spot about halfway and set up a small fire to eat lunch before finishing the hike out. I made it to the halfway point and sat on a log near another small clearing. It was surrounded by heavy brush and had just one narrow entrance, which made me feel a little safer. I had just started eating when I heard what sounded like a branch snap. Not behind me, but in front of me, deeper in the brush. I froze. Then I heard another one. I stood up slowly, holding my knife again, and scanned the woods. First, I saw nothing. Then, just past the brush, I saw what looked like a head. A person, crouched low, partially hidden behind a tree. Not moving, not making a sound, just watching. They weren't wearing a shirt. I could just barely make out their bare shoulders and long, matted hair. I stared for a long time, not blinking. They didn't move. I backed away slowly, heart thudding in my chest, keeping my eyes on the figure. I turned and walked as calmly as I could back toward the trail. I didn't run. I was too scared to make noise. I walked fast but quiet, constantly checking behind me. After about 15 minutes, I stopped to listen. Nothing. I kept going, trying to remember every twist in the trail. But the woods out there aren't marked. It's just turns and landmarks you have to remember. After a while, I started realizing I wasn't seeing familiar things anymore. The downed log I'd crossed earlier wasn't there. The split tree I used as a landmark was missing. Somehow I'd gotten turned around. I fought panic. I sat down, drank some water, and pulled out my compass. I knew the general direction of the fire road and tried to cut straight through the woods toward it. That was probably a mistake. The undergrowth got thicker. Thorn bushes tore at my clothes. My boots sank in soft spots of mud. I started hearing noises again. Small rustles that stopped when I stopped. At one point, I turned suddenly and caught a glimpse of someone moving between two trees. Too far to make out clearly, but they were there, watching again. I kept going faster now. By the time I finally saw the road through the trees, it was nearly sunset. I burst through the last line of brush, muddy and bleeding from thorns, and staggered onto the gravel. My car was still where I left it. I unlocked it, jumped inside, and locked the doors. I sat there, shaking. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, trying to calm down. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my skin crawl. There were fingerprints on the back window. Not fresh. Smudged like someone had pressed their hands there and dragged them slightly downward. The car had been locked, and I hadn't been gone more than a day and a half. I started the car and drove fast until I hit pavement and got cell service again. I called my brother first, then the police. They told me to wait somewhere safe. I didn't want to sit alone in the car on the side of the road, so I drove to a small public park and waited there until someone called back. Now I'm back near the trailhead because the officers asked me to meet them here. I got here early and climbed this hill to get signal so I could post this. My arms are covered in scratches, my pants are torn, and I've got a splitting headache from dehydration and stress. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. I just know that it wasn't an accident that they kept watching, hiding, and following. The sun is finally starting to rise. After I hit post, I will go back to the car so we can wait there until the police arrive. I went camping alone on a beach a few years ago, and to this day, I still think about that night more than I'd like to admit. I've told a few people about it over the years, but I never really get into the details because every time I start thinking too deeply about it, I get that tight, uncomfortable feeling in my chest. I never went camping alone again after that. I'm not sure I ever will. It was in late September. I remember that because the evenings were just starting to get chilly, but during the day it was still warm enough to wear a t-shirt. I'd taken a few days off work and just needed to get away from everything. No phone calls, no traffic, no people. I wasn't trying to prove anything to myself. I wasn't seeking some kind of spiritual retreat. I just wanted quiet. I'd always liked the ocean, and I remembered this spot I'd gone to once before with a friend. A long, quiet beach tucked off a side rode a little ways out from the town where I grew up. The beach wasn't marked on any tourist map. It wasn't even labeled on Google Maps. Really, just a stretch of open land next to the water. You had to park a bit inland and hike in about a quarter mile through a thin strip of woods and sand dunes. Once you got through, the trees opened up and gave way to a wide, empty shoreline. The kind of place you might see a fisherman at early in the morning or someone walking their dog if you stayed close to the trailhead. But if you walked down the shore far enough, it was easy to find total solitude. I arrived in the afternoon, probably around 3 or 4. I parked my car on the side of the dirt road, pulled on my pack, and made my way in. I'd packed light, a one-person tent, a small sleeping bag, a headlamp, a little propane burner, and just enough food for 2 nights. Nothing fancy. My plan was to stay 2 nights and head back on the 3rd morning. The walk-in was easy. The dunes were covered in dry grass, and the trail was mostly packed sand. I hiked for about 20 minutes until I found a spot I liked. Far enough from the entrance that I hadn't seen anyone else, but still close enough that if something went wrong, I could make it back without too much trouble. The beach was wide there, with a little ridge of dry sand that sat just above the high tide line. I set up my tent on that ridge, facing the water. There were no trees nearby, just a few scattered driftwood logs and tufts of grass sticking out of the sand. Behind me, the dunes climbed up to a low, scrubby ridge that blocked the view of the parking area. From where I was, I couldn't see a single sign of civilization. It felt like the whole place belonged to me. I spent the rest of the day walking along the water, collecting shells and pieces of weathered sea glass, watching the gulls swoop and dive. I made a little dinner as the sun was going down. Just some rice and beans warmed over the propane stove, and sat on a piece of driftwood watching the sky turn pink and gold over the ocean. The waves were calm, rolling in slowly and steadily. The breeze smelled like salt and seaweed. It was perfect. By the time it was dark, I was ready to call it a night. I didn't bother with a fire. I brought a book, but I didn't even get through a full chapter. The sound of the waves was hypnotic, and the cool air made it easy to curl up in my sleeping bag and drift off. I remember falling asleep thinking I'd found exactly what I needed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't the usual kind of waking up you get when you're camping and hear a raccoon digging through your food bag. It wasn't a sudden jolt either. It was like my brain just gently pulled me out of sleep, like something had changed around me and my body noticed before my conscious mind caught up. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening. The ocean was still there, the waves rolling in and out. That sound hadn't changed. I didn't hear footsteps, no talking, no animals, just the wind and the water. Then I heard it. It was faint, so soft I thought I might have imagined it at first. A kind of brushing sound, like something dragging against the side of the tent. Not scratching, not scraping, just brushing. Almost like a hand gently running across the fabric. I didn't move. My heart started beating a little faster, but I told myself it was probably just the wind. Maybe a gust had blown some tall grass against the tent, or maybe some sand was shifting down from the dunes behind me. I tried to let it go, to drift back into sleep, but then it came again. This time it wasn't subtle. The tent rustled, and I heard the brushing clearly. It started on one side and slowly moved around toward the back. Not a gust, not the wind. Something was deliberately moving around the tent. I sat up slowly. My sleeping bag made a soft rustling sound, and I winced at how loud it seemed. My heart was pounding now. I was wide awake, every nerve on high alert. Then, without warning, the sides of the tent started pushing inward. Not just in one spot. All around me, I froze. The nylon walls of the tent caved in as though hands were pressing against them from every direction. I could see the shapes, fingers, palms, pressing into the fabric. Not slamming or hitting, just pushing, holding, testing. No voices, no footsteps, just the ocean in the background and the faint whisper of shifting fabric. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even breathe. I just stared at those shapes, my mouth dry and my entire body locked in place. I felt like an animal cornered in a trap. Every second stretched on forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The pressure on the tent vanished. The walls bounced back into shape. The shapes of the hands disappeared. I stayed frozen in place, still not trusting that it was over. I must have sat like that for a full 5 minutes before I even reached for my flashlight. I didn't hear anything outside. No running, no laughing, no footsteps crunching in the sand. Just the steady rhythm of the ocean, as calm as ever. Eventually, I leaned forward, reached for the zipper, and slowly opened the tent door just enough to poke my head out. I flicked on my flashlight and swept it in a wide circle. Nothing, just sand, driftwood, and the quiet black stretch of beach. But then I looked down. There were footprints all around the tent. Clear ones, dozens of them. Some were close together, like someone had been standing still. Others showed where someone had walked in circles. I couldn't tell how many sets there were, but definitely more than one. Some looked larger, others smaller. Barefoot, shoes, a mix of both. I stepped out fully and turned the light in a wider arc. The prints led away from the tent in different directions, some toward the dunes, some along the beach, some back toward the trail. The sand was disturbed in long, shallow scuffs, like someone had dragged their feet. I followed a few of the tracks until they faded out near the waterline or disappeared into the grass. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat in the tent with my flashlight on, listening. I kept the zipper partially open so I could see out. I thought about packing up right then and there and heading back to the car, but the thought of walking through the dark dunes with no moonlight and barely any trail felt worse than staying put. When the sky started turning gray and the light started to come back, I finally stepped outside again. The footprints were still there, though the wind had softened the edges. I packed up quickly, not even bothering with breakfast. I just shoved everything into my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and started back toward the car. I kept glancing behind me as I walked. I didn't see anyone. The beach was empty. The dunes were quiet. When I reached the car, I tossed my gear in the trunk and just stood there for a minute, trying to slow my breathing. I looked back at the trailhead, at the trees and the beach beyond. Nothing moved. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove straight home. I spent the rest of that day trying to make sense of it. I kept going over what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. I looked up reports of weird incidents in the area. Vandalism, assaults, anything, but found nothing. The beach wasn't even listed as a public area. It was just a forgotten stretch of sand off the side of a back road. The most logical explanation, the one I keep telling myself, is that it was a group of kids, maybe high, maybe drunk, messing with me. They saw the tent, saw I was alone, and decided to scare the hell out of me. It makes sense, at least on paper. But the thing that still eats at me is how quiet they were. No laughing, no talking, no footsteps running away, just silence. They were right outside my tent, pushing the sides, watching me. And they didn't say a word. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They didn't even leave any kind of message. They just let me sit there in terror, then vanished. It was deliberate, controlled. That's what made it so much worse. I never went back to that beach. I deleted the GPS marker I had saved. I didn't even tell my family about it. What would I say? That some barefoot strangers surrounded my tent at 3 in the morning and pressed their hands into the sides just to scare me? I've camped plenty of times in my life. Mountains, woods, lakes. But that night was different. That wasn't nature. That was people. And people are the scariest thing out there. When I was a kid, my family used to go camping every year, usually during the holidays, with a few other families we were close with. It was one of those traditions that you kind of assume everyone does, like it's just what life is. Back then, it didn't seem like anything special. Just another trip out to the bush with people we saw all the time. But now, as an adult, I look back at those trips with a kind of longing. They were simple. No phones, no traffic, no jobs to stress over. Just dirt trails, the smell of smoke from the campfire, and the feeling of being part of something bigger than your own little world. There were usually about 4 or 5 families that came, sometimes more if someone brought a cousin or a friend along. Altogether, that meant a decent crowd. The adults usually grouped themselves together, sitting around the fire, cooking, talking, drinking. They'd take turns handling meals or doing the setup, but for the most part, they left us kids alone. There were 9 of us on that particular trip, all between the ages of maybe 4 to 10. The older ones looked after the younger ones, and we had our own world apart from the grown-ups. The trip I'm thinking of happened around Christmas. I was 5. I only know that because I remember one of the older kids telling me I was finally allowed to help hang lights around the tents. The grown-ups had brought a few strings of solar fairy lights to wrap around the tent poles and trees. It was a bush Christmas, which meant tinsel wrapped around sticks, cheap battery-powered decorations blinking at random, and paper crowns from bonbons that didn't fit anyone's head right. It was hot, dusty, full of flies, and back then I thought it was the most magical place on earth. We were camping in a national park somewhere inland. I couldn't tell you where exactly. It's just the bush in my memory. Nothing but red dirt, tall thin trees, and dry grass that made a kind of crunching sound underfoot. The campground wasn't an official one, just a clearing the adults knew about from previous trips. No facilities, no running water, no other campers. That was part of the appeal. Every morning after breakfast, we kids would be handed a walkie-talkie and told we could explore. We were supposed to stay within a certain area, no more than a few minutes walk from the tents, but there weren't any hard lines drawn. As long as we answered when the walkie chirped, we were fine. That morning had been like any other. We'd eaten pancakes off paper plates, smeared with too much jam, and then bolted off into the trees with our hats on and shoes already full of sand. There was a big fallen tree not too far from camp where we liked to climb and sit. That's where we were when it happened. The walkie was sitting in the grass next to us. I wasn't holding it. None of us were. It had gone quiet for a while, which was normal. We'd check in every half hour or so, but mostly the adults just left it on to be safe. Then, without any crackle or warning, a man's voice came through. "I'm Santa," he said. "I'm trying to find you to give you your presents. Can you help me find you?" I remember that exact phrasing, even now. It didn't sound scary at the time. It sounded exciting. I didn't recognize the voice. It definitely wasn't one of the dads or uncles or any of the older kids trying to be funny. It was calm, low, kind of friendly in a forced way, like how adults talk to kids when they're trying too hard to sound fun. We all froze. Someone picked up the walkie. One of the older kids, maybe Ben or Luke. They were the kind of kids who always liked to take charge. I think one of them started talking back into it, but I can't remember what they said. We were all buzzing, shouting over each other, saying, "He said Santa. He said Santa." We started running back toward camp, laughing and tripping over roots. When we got back, we barreled into the clearing, yelling that Santa had talked to us. The adults didn't smile. They didn't look excited. Everything shifted fast. One of the dads, Tony, I think, snatched the walkie from us and started clicking it, asking who was on the line, demanding answers. Another dad was already walking toward the perimeter of the camp, looking out into the trees. The rest of us were told to sit down and stay put. The mood went cold real fast. I didn't understand what was happening. Not really, but I remember the way all the adults stood together, whispering in that stiff, serious way that grown-ups do when they don't want kids to hear. We weren't allowed to go back out for the rest of the trip. They didn't say why. They didn't need to. We could feel it. Something was wrong. The walkies got turned off and packed away. A couple of the dads walked into the bush, saying they were going to check the area. They came back later, empty-handed and sweating, but they didn't talk about it in front of us. I heard little things, bits of conversation I didn't really understand at the time. Words like frequency, someone nearby, and not right. That night, the fire burned lower than usual. There was no music, no drinks, no games, just quiet. The parents kept looking out into the trees, flinching at little sounds. We left a day early. That never happened. Usually, these trips lasted 4 or 5 days at least, sometimes a full week. But the next morning, everything was packed up quickly. The tents were rolled up, the lights came down, and the cars were loaded. None of the adults smiled. On the drive home, I remember staring out the window, trying to see if there was a sleigh hidden in the bush, if maybe we'd missed Santa. It wasn't until years later that I really understood what had happened. Someone had gotten onto our walkie channel. Someone who wasn't part of our group. Someone who was close enough to know we were there, who had listened long enough to know kids were using that frequency. It didn't take much to figure out how to sound convincing to a group of bush-hyped kids just before Christmas. He didn't say he had candy. He didn't try to lure anyone with puppies or toys. He said he was Santa. That's all it took. Looking back, I realize how bad it could have been. If the walkie had come through just a little earlier or later when we were farther from camp, if one of the older kids had thought it was just a prank and told us to go find him, if we hadn't gone straight back, there are a dozen different ways it could have gone differently. No one reported it, not that I know of. There wasn't really anyone to report it to. The middle of the bush, no exact location, no cell service back then. Just a bad feeling, a voice on a walkie-talkie, and a bunch of scared adults trying to hold it together for the sake of their kids. We never camped in that exact spot again. The next year, we went somewhere closer to town, somewhere with other people around. I don't think we ever brought the walkies again either. As a kid, I remember being disappointed. I thought we were in trouble for something. I thought we'd ruined Christmas. But as an adult, now that I know how things work, now that I understand what could have happened, I can still feel that chill, that low, calm voice asking us to help him find us. I don't think about it often, but when I do, it's not with fear exactly. It's with a kind of cold realization that someone out there in the middle of nowhere had been watching, had waited for a moment when the adults weren't paying attention, had taken the chance to speak to a group of excited, unsupervised kids. We got lucky. That's really all it was. Nothing heroic, no big showdown. Just blind, stupid luck. And that's why I think the adults never talked about it again. Not because they didn't care, but because they knew just how close it had come to being something worse. Something none of us would have forgotten for a different reason. Years later, I found that same brand of walkie-talkie at a garage sale. I held it in my hand and felt something twist in my gut. It was such a cheap little thing. Plastic, scratched, missing a battery cover. But I put it down and walked away. Some things are better left in the bush. I've always found something eerie about cats. Not in the mystical, ancient symbol sense, just in how quiet they are, how deliberate they are. Their movements are clean, purposeful, almost calculating. I'd never thought too deeply about it until I got my second cat, a kitten who bounced around the house like static electricity. My older cat, Malcolm, watched her with this strange kind of tolerance that felt more like observation than affection. It was like he was gathering data on her. One time, I saw Malcolm crawl behind the couch while the kitten played, disappear beside a crumpled jacket, and then simply vanish. No movement, no tail. The kitten spun around looking for him, eyes wide, and Malcolm was just gone. It didn't make sense. I walked over and crouched. Sure enough, he was curled under the folds of the jacket, pressed so flat, and still he may as well have evaporated. The kitten gave up eventually and walked away, and only then did Malcolm slowly stand and stretch, slipping out without making a sound. After that, I started noticing things. The bell on his collar didn't always ring. He had figured out how to move in a way that silenced it. Sometimes he'd walk right past me and I wouldn't hear a thing. He only jingled when he wanted to, and it got me thinking, what if he were bigger? Not even tiger-sized, just big enough to make me pray. That's when the idea wormed into my brain, the kind you try not to think about because it feels wrong or maybe too possible. I told myself I was just overthinking it. I laughed it off. But even then, I knew it had lodged somewhere deeper. I started seeing Malcolm differently. He'd perch on shelves and stare at me for minutes on end. His head wouldn't move, just his eyes. I told myself I was imagining it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I shrank just a few feet shorter, I wouldn't last a week with him in the same house. That was before I left the city, before the woods. After my dad died, I inherited this piece of land he'd been sitting on for years. 15 acres of forest and a cabin up north, way off the grid. No neighbors, no cell service. I'd been burned out from work, the kind of tired that settles in your bones, and figured some time in the trees might reset me. I took a leave from work, packed up my gear, and drove 6 hours north with a cooler full of supplies and Malcolm in a carrier. The first few days were exactly what I wanted. Peaceful, cold in the mornings and silent at night, with nothing but wind and the distant sounds of owls or bugs. I split firewood, walked the land, cleaned out the cabin. Malcolm adjusted quicker than I thought he would. He liked the windows, sitting on the sills and watching the trees. I only let him out when I was close by. I didn't want to lose him, but I also trusted him more than most animals I'd known. He was smart, too smart. The woods around the cabin were thick. Tight brush, tall pines, the kind of land that absorbs sound. You could yell and it wouldn't carry. Everything felt muffled, like the trees were swallowing noise. I walked the trails during the day, marking them with bits of colored tape so I wouldn't lose my way. There were old deer paths, signs of coyotes. Nothing unusual. But as the days passed, I started feeling something else, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my nerves, the quiet messing with my head. Then Malcolm started acting strange. He wanted out more often, but when I let him go, he wouldn't chase birds or roll in the dirt like usual. He'd slip into the undergrowth and vanish. I tried following him once and lost him after 20 seconds. No bell, no rustling, just gone. When he came back, he was twitchy, alert, like he'd seen something out there, or worse, like he was guarding something. It all built slow. First, the sounds. I'd hear rustling just outside the cabin at night. I figured it was raccoons. Then heavier steps, like something larger moving through the brush. Still not unheard of. But then I'd wake up in the middle of the night and Malcolm would be sitting at the window, completely still, staring into the trees. One night, I watched him for nearly 30 minutes. He didn't blink once. A few days later, I decided to follow him again. This time in the late afternoon when the sun was still up but starting to lower. I wore boots, gloves, and a light pack and followed him as best I could. He walked slow at first, tail up, moving along one of the game trails. I stayed 20 feet behind, watching for movement. Every so often he'd glance back, as if checking to see if I was still there. But the deeper we went, the faster he moved. I started losing him around a bend, and when I rounded the corner, he was gone. No sound, no tracks. I looked up, down, side to side. The forest was dead silent. No birds, not even bugs. I stood still for a long time. Then I heard it. Not Malcolm, not his bell, but the sound of something shifting behind a tree to my left. I turned fast, but whatever it was had ducked out of sight. I crouched low and waited, heart hammering. Another sound to my right, a branch flexing under weight. Then silence. Something was circling me. I couldn't explain it. It was just a sense, like pressure. I backed up slowly, trying to remember which way I'd come, but the trail looked different now. The colored tape I tied to a branch wasn't there. Or maybe I hadn't come this way at all. Then I heard it again, the softest jingle of a bell. Just once, then nothing. I turned and moved, not running but walking fast, trying to get some distance. I scanned every tree trunk, every shadow, but the woods all looked the same. My breathing grew louder. The silence of the forest made it sound like I was dragging a megaphone behind me. Another sound, branches shifting, dry leaves moving, but no clear direction. Then, dead ahead, I saw a crumpled jacket on the ground. Familiar. Mine. One I'd lost 2 days ago and thought I'd left back at the cabin. It was laid out in a strange way, half folded, like someone had tried to mimic how it would look if someone dropped it casually. But it was too neat, too placed. Something moved behind it. I froze. Then I saw the tip of Malcolm's tail, just the tip curling behind a tree. I called his name instinctively. Nothing. No bell. I took one step forward. Two. Then, in one sudden motion, a shape bolted from behind the jacket. I staggered back. It was Malcolm, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me. I turned fast. Nothing. Just trees. But he was still staring. His back was arched, tail puffed out. He was in full alert. I didn't wait. I scooped him up, stuffed him into my coat, and started moving in what I hoped was the right direction. The trip back felt endless. The woods didn't look the same. I couldn't find the trail markers. The light faded faster than I expected. And every few minutes, I'd hear the soft jingle of a bell, sometimes behind me, sometimes ahead. But Malcolm's bell wasn't making a sound. He was tucked tight in my jacket, rigid and silent. At some point, I spotted a sliver of metal through the trees. My truck, parked beside the cabin. Relief hit me like a wave. I didn't stop moving until I was through the door, Malcolm in my arms, slamming it shut and locking every latch I could find. That night, Malcolm didn't move from the corner of the room. He kept his eyes on the window the entire time. In the morning, I went out to the trail with a small hatchet and marked a few trees, trying to retrace my steps. About 100 feet in, I found the jacket again. But this time, it was folded perfectly, sitting on a low stump. The air felt wrong, still, pressurized, like a vacuum. I didn't touch it, I just turned around and walked back to the cabin. That evening, I packed everything: food, clothes, gear. I stuffed Malcolm in the carrier and left before the sun went down. Drove until I saw cell service again and didn't stop until I was back in the city. I still have the land, but I haven't gone back. I rent it out sometimes to hunters or campers, but I never give them the back trail map. I never mention the jacket. Malcolm's still with me, older now, slower, but he still watches, still disappears when he wants to. And sometimes at night, when everything's quiet and I've turned out the lights, I'll hear the softest little jingle, even when he's asleep beside me. It never lasts long, just long enough to remind me he's still there, and that something else might be too.